Russian leader Vladimir Putin has found himself in a dead end in the war against Ukraine. Despite prolonged fighting, the Kremlin has no idea how to achieve victory and is only accumulating problems. This is written by Edward Carr, deputy editor of The Economist. He notes that if the war continues until June 2026, it will surpass the First World War in duration. Carr draws a historical parallel. The Allies were able to break through German positions. In 1918, just as today, Ukraine continues to resist, while Russia does not know how to gain the upper hand. In his opinion, a dictator who lacks a theory of victory inevitably accumulates risks. Petro Oleshchuk, political scientist and lecturer at Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv, is now live with us in the studio. Welcome, Mr. Petro.
Thank you.
So Putin has found himself at a dead end in the war against Ukraine. The fighting continues. He doesn't know how to win, as analysts report in their article. But can he actually stop? Because he has to take into account both political and social risks. The entire army that's now fighting at the front could return and potentially overthrow Putin himself.
I think he himself is convinced that in the end he will defeat everyone. He regularly receives such reports. He's used to ignoring the state of the economy because he believes it's unimportant compared to the global goals he's pursuing. I am more than certain that he regularly receives information from his, let's say, ministers and generally from people who have contact with him about certain problems in the economy. That it would be better to wrap up this war, but most likely he doesn't listen to anyone because he has become completely convinced that he must achieve victory, that this is some kind of decisive, extremely important, significant war, and so on. At the same time, again, I think that right now there are many directions in which the timing is being determined. Still, perhaps Putin's position will change depending on certain objective circumstances that even he will not be able to ignore. What do I mean by that? Well, of course, it's the sanctions. It's clear that the sanctions have not fully achieved the objectives set for them due to sanctions evasion and because they have often been rather half-hearted and inconsistent in many respects. But in my opinion, their impact is less significant. And the recorded largest discount on Russian oil in a year demonstrates that, in principle, sanctions against Russian oil companies are not just empty words. The next sanctions are being imposed by Ukrainian special services. In particular, today's latest operation carried out by the SBU, the GUR, and other relevant agencies, I mean the attack on the port in Novorossiysk. This is a very telling story, which, by the way, has already had an impact even on the global oil market. Prices have risen there, and many see this as a risk for Ukraine. But if prices rise not because of Russian oil, then frankly, we don't care. It's clear to us that in the near future, Russia won't be able to use this terminal to export oil. And this is one example of the kind of sanctions that Ukraine is directly imposing with its drones and with other appropriate means. And this also works in a certain way. So one way or another, sooner or later, even the Russian dictator obsessed with the war against Ukraine will be forced to admit that something needs to be done about this because the risks to his regime will continue to grow. I agree that he probably sees ending the war as a risk to his regime, especially in the context of soldiers returning home and in general, that this mobilization of society will immediately disappear. But on the other hand, continuing the war will also carry certain risks. And so once again, I can't say when the idea that ending it is actually easier will prevail, because the Russian leadership does not always act based on rational reasons or motives. Nevertheless, all these factors inevitably have an impact in the end.
Mr. Petro, we have just a minute left to talk. What domestic political scenarios are possible for Russia if the war drags on?
Well, again, it's quite difficult to predict Russian politics because it is closed off and non-public. It's clear that Putin's paranoia, which is widely discussed, did not arise out of nowhere. After all, we can recall the attempted Prigozhin mutiny. So I assume that his paranoia will continue to grow, and at the same time, the risks of a real coup will also increase because, in the end, all of this affects the pockets of specific individuals. The fact that Russians are dying there or that something is connected to this doesn't concern anyone in the Russian elite at all. But the fact that someone is directly touching their income, I think that will worry many of them one way or another. And again, even the Russian dictator won't be able to ignore this. But I repeat, he obviously tends to rely more on his own ideas about history or his own vision of history rather than on rational arguments. That's why it's quite difficult to predict. It's enough to recall that, for example, the entire American School of Criminology was unable to predict the collapse of the USSR. And this, in my opinion, is quite telling.
Mr. Petro, thank you. Petro Oleshchuk, political scientist and lecturer at Taras Shevchenko National University of Kyiv, was live with us in the studio.